So, first of all, Napoleon, he rose to power as a result of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, obviously, the French people overthrew their king, and then they were involved in a series of wars because all the other nations of Europe basically ganged up against France because they didn't want revolutionary republican governments to kind of spring up in their own countries. However, during this time, obviously, you had the elimination of the very entrenched class system, which you had in France, and this allowed Napoleon Bonaparte to rise up through the ranks. So I'm not going to give it a long history about like Napoleon, and like his life story and stuff, right? But all you need to know is that, as we said, he rose through the ranks and he eventually ended up crowning himself emperor in 1804. So in 1805, Napoleon tried to invade England because out of all the different enemies that France had, England had always been like the strongest against them, right? And this basically ended up failing because of the Battle of Trafalgar, in which the British fleet ended up destroying the French and Spanish fleet, and this basically completely destroyed the French navy. So Napoleon was no longer able to invade Britain. So what he ended up doing instead was setting up what's known as the Continental System. So the Continental System was basically France and its allies, basically being banned from trading with Britain at all. So this was not very popular in many parts of the continent, especially amongst France's so-called allies, because realistically, France didn't really have allies. It kind of just had defeated these countries in war and basically, installed either puppet regimes like, people within Napoleon's family and put them on the throne of different countries, or they just had kind of been made to kowtow, because of like being defeated in battle. So, the rulers of these places were, in most parts, like very reluctant to actually go along with this. And on top of that, the people of the countries were not very happy with it as well. So this led to a great deal of smuggling, etc., etc. However, in 1810, Russia ended up withdrawing from the Continental System. Now, the reason for this is because, twofold. One, because Russia's exports end up being reduced by about 40% during this time, because Russia at that time traded a lot with England, and then on top of that, this led to an increase of debts and it led to inflation. So that was the first reason as to why Russia withdrew from it. The second reason was because France had basically allowed West Galicia to join with the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. So the Grand Duchy of Warsaw is basically a French puppet state, which is basically within Poland. And this was as a result of Poland being divided up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 1795. So Poland wouldn't exist as a country, and from 1795 up until 1918. So by Napoleon giving the Grand Duchy of Warsaw this extra territory in Western Galicia, right, which he had taken from the Austrians, this ended up greatly expanding the border between Russia and a French ally. So these two things combined, one, Russia being affected by the Continental System, and two, this greater expansion on its border of basically a hostile neighbour, this greatly threatened Tsar Alexander I. So in response to this, Napoleon got very angry and he decided, right, that's it. I'm going to teach the Russians a lesson, and he sent a very strongly worded letter of declaration of war to the Russians. And at this point, he assembled a massive army of about 422,000 men, right? And this was mainly French people from like the so-called Grand Army, and then also a few French allies and stuff, right? And the idea was that they were going to go straight to Russia. They're going to seize Moscow. They're going to basically completely humiliate and destroy the Russians, and that would teach them a lesson for breaking the blockade against the British. Now, Russia in this time, it was a growing power in Europe, but it still wasn't like where it would be, later on within this century, right? So it was still very backward. It was still very feudal, and its army, while it was large, it wasn't, as organized as some of the other armies on the continent would be, basically. So Russia at this point wasn't really at the same level as a lot of the different armies within Europe, right? And on top of that, Napoleon had defeated the Russians in several different of these wars, because what we have to understand is that the Napoleonic Wars wasn't just one big war, right? It was a series of different conflicts involving different coalitions against the French, and so they'd already been defeated before, and Napoleon kind of was like, right, we'll be able to defeat them again. However, the Grand Armée was used to fighting in Europe, right? And within Europe, you have places which are densely populated. You have fields and stuff which are very fertile, and you also have like a good like road network between the different towns and cities and stuff, right? So it makes like marching like between one place and another very easy, and this is kind of what led to a lot of Napoleon's victories, because he was able to outflank and surprise his enemies by how quickly his army was able to maneuver and like to get to where they needed to be. However, Russia was was completely different to this, right? Russia, was very sparsely populated. It had, you go for miles and miles in Russia with just like fields and fields and fields, very few towns, very few cities, and small populations in both. And on top of that, the road system was just meh. Okay, and so when Napoleon invaded on the 24th of June 1812, which is 2 days after Barbarossa, right? So Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that took place on the 22nd of June, right? So Napoleon and Hitler both invaded Russia roughly the same time of year, right? And there was lots of parallels between that invasion and the later invasion. And one of the main things is that during the summer months in Russia, it's ridiculously hot, right? So these troops are marching for miles and miles and miles in extreme heat, and on top of that, you then have a lot of rain, and this ends up mixing with the very poor roads that they have there, and you're having basically mudslides and stuff. Basically the whole countryside ends up being like rivers of mud, and this in Russian is known as the Rasputitsa. I think I pronounced that correctly. And so the Rasputitsa, this is basically when the roads are pretty much impassable. This even slowed down the Germans in 1941. So they had tanks and stuff, and even that helped to basically slow down the German advance there. On top of that, a few centuries before, it slowed down the Mongols, and this is why the city of Novgorod was never conquered by the Mongols, because whether it's modern military or whether it's like cavalry and stuff, those roads are impassable. And actually something along the lines of about like 1,000 horses per day were lost by the French army in this summer campaign, and many hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen end up dying along the way as well, right? So this is what we'll kind of get onto a little bit later in the video, when we kind of focus on like what ends up being the casualties. A lot of the focus is put on the winter campaign, but not enough was put on the summer, right? So on the way there, there's 422,000 Frenchmen who end up setting off for Russia, and over the next few months, these numbers severely dwindle, and we'll get onto those figures a little bit later. So by August of 1812, you had the famous Battle of Smolensk, and this battle was very decisive, and it's included in Tolstoy's War and Peace. So definitely, see the TV series that the BBC did a few years ago. That was like really, really good. Also, as well, obviously, just read the book or just watch some other film on it. It's really, really good, and it'll help you to understand a lot of like the history of this, especially from a Russian perspective. So you had the Battle of Smolensk, and then after that, you had the Battle of Borodino. Because up until this point, the Russian strategy was basically one of scorched earth and retreat, right? So, what you do is you basically, burn all the crops, you burn the villages, etc., etc. You basically make it so that the French armies, which are used to being able to go around places and forage for food and like steal from the locals and stuff, you basically strip them of any ability to get food and of shelter, and then it becomes very difficult for them, as Napoleon said, an army marched on its stomach, and so if you basically starve the stomach, then the army kind of grinds to a halt. And Borodino, although on paper it was a French victory, it was actually quite a Pyrrhic victory, which means that as a victory it comes at a great cost, because a third of the fighting force of the French was lost at this one battle, right? And this on the way to Moscow. So although they end up winning this battle, and then 7 days later they end up taking Moscow, by the time they get to Moscow, Moscow is ablaze, right? They set fire even to Moscow, which at the time was not the capital, but historically had been like the cultural center point of Russia, right? So the French end up getting there. There's nothing in the city. It's all just ablaze, and end up being held up there for 5 weeks, right? And at this point, the Russian winter starts to set in. And it's clear at this point that Napoleon is not going to be able to just capture the Russian military, because they're going to be able to just keep retreating. So at this point, Napoleon had to make a decision. We're in Moscow, we're in like the ruins of Moscow, there's no shelter, there's no food, and winter is coming, right? So at this point, he decides to retreat. And early on in November, he ends up getting word that there's going to be a coup potentially in Paris, right? So, he leaves his men, he gets on a sleigh, and he goes straight back to Paris. And his men, what's left of the army, has to march slowly back to the Russian border, right? And during this time, you have the Cossacks. So the Cossacks are basically cavalrymen in Russia. They're very irregular forces and stuff, yeah. And they're used to basically following armies and then striking at the opportune moment, with sabers and stuff, attack them, and then they retreat back into the forest, right? So all the way back, they keep getting attacked. Also, as well, you had local Russians who were partisans, and they were attacking them. So much the same way you see with the Germans, during Operation Barbarossa, they keep being held back by the local Russians and stuff, right? And bit by bit, the army ends up just getting worn down and worn down and worn down. And it's not until the 14th of December that the French are finally able to get across, right? So as we said before, right, they went in with this force of 422,000 men. Only 100,000 of them actually reached Moscow. And by the time they end up retreating back across the Russian border, something like only 10,000 of them end up surviving. Now, obviously, the figures for this end up, depending on what source you read, people weren't very great at keeping records in those days. So, depending on what historian you look at, there's different things. But for the in order to keep some level of consistency, we're sticking with one data set here, right? So this is an absolutely crushing defeat, right? The casualty rate for this is something like 95%, right? And it's just, so the Grand Armée is pretty much no more, right? So with this alternative history, we're basically going to be like, right, what if Napoleon had just kind of, held together, restrained himself and been like, right, I'm not going to invade Russia? How would history and, the history of France, the history of Europe, how would the history of Russia have been different if this hadn't have happened? That's what we're going to look into now.